They thought he was just the cleaning guy. But the janitor mopping floors at Meridian Energy had a secret that would terrify every executive in the building. In 72 hours, his discovery would either prevent a nuclear catastrophe or make him disappear forever. If you love stories where truth triumphs over power, smash that subscribe button and hit notifications. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like dying insects, casting harsh shadows across the pristine corridors of Meridian Energy Corporation. It was 3:17 a.m., and the building should have been empty except for the skeletal night crew that kept the corporate machine humming through the dark hours. But tonight, something was different. Tonight, there was a presence in the sub-level monitoring station that didn't belong there, fingers dancing across keyboards that weren't meant for his clearance level, eyes scanning data streams that could topple governments. Michael Weber pushed his cleaning cart aside with deliberate care, the wheels squeaking softly against the polished concrete floor. 23 years he'd been walking these halls, mopping spills and emptying trash bins, invisible to the suits who rushed past him during daylight hours. 23 years of being nothing more than background noise in a symphony of corporate ambition. But Michael Weber had a secret that would have shocked every executive who'd ever looked through him like he was made of glass. Before he became the ghost who cleaned their messes, he had been Dr. Michael Weber, one of the most brilliant nuclear engineers in the industry, a man whose research had once promised to revolutionize clean energy production. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. It had been a slow, agonizing descent from the penthouse of professional success to the basement of blue-collar anonymity. A single miscalculation in reactor safety protocols, a single moment of human error that led to a containment breach at his previous company, and suddenly the golden boy of sustainable energy became a pariah. The incident had been covered up, the record sealed, but Michael's career was obliterated in the process. No one would hire a man whose mistake had nearly caused an environmental disaster, even if that mistake had ultimately led to improved safety standards across the entire industry. So he had reinvented himself, taking a job that required no background checks, no references, no questions about his past. He became Michael the janitor, Michael the invisible man, Michael who knew more about nuclear physics than most of the engineers who now walked these halls, but chose to push a mop instead of pushing boundaries. IT was penance, he told himself, a way to atone for the hubris that had nearly cost lives. But tonight, as he stared at the anomalous readings scrolling across the monitoring station screens, Michael realized that his exile might have positioned him to prevent something far worse than anything he had ever caused. The numbers didn't lie, even when the people interpreting them did. Radiation levels in Sector 7 had been climbing steadily for 3 weeks, a pattern so subtle that the automated systems hadn't triggered any alerts. But Michael's trained eye caught what the algorithms missed: the gradual degradation of containment protocols, the microscopic increases in particle emission, the telltale signature of a system pushed beyond its safe operational limits. Someone was cooking the books, manipulating the safety data to hide a catastrophic failure in progress. And if his calculations were correct, they had maybe 72 hours before a meltdown that would make history for all the wrong reasons. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the corridor, sharp and purposeful against the ambient hum of machinery. Michael's hands froze over the keyboard as security badges beeped and doors whispered open behind him. He had seconds to decide: disappear back into his janitor's invisibility or stand his ground and reveal that the cleaning men knew more about their systems than their own engineers. "Sir, you're not authorized to be in this area." The voice was young, uncertain, belonging to a security guard who probably made more in overtime than Michael earned in a month. The kid's hand hovered near his radio, protocol warring with confusion as he tried to process the sight of a janitor hunched over a classified monitoring station at 3 in the morning. Michael turned slowly, his weathered hands still resting on the keyboard, and for the first time in 23 years, he looked someone in the eye without flinching. "Son," he said, his voice carrying an authority that seemed to emanate from somewhere deeper than his janitor's uniform. "I'm probably the only person in this building who is authorized to understand what these numbers mean. And right now, these numbers are telling me that this facility is about to become a very expensive tomb." Dr. Sarah Chun had always prided herself on being the kind of CEO who arrived first and left last. But lately, those principles felt more like a prison than a badge of honor. At 2:45 a.m., She sat alone in her corner office on the 42nd floor, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a panoramic view of the sleeping city below. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was literally looking down on millions of people whose lives depended on the decisions made in rooms like this one, by people like her, who often seemed more concerned with quarterly reports than quarterly safety inspections. The call from building security had come through just minutes ago, disrupting her late-night review of the environmental impact assessments that would determine whether Meridian's new reactor design received federal approval. A janitor had been found in a restricted area, apparently attempting to access classified monitoring systems. Under normal circumstances, it would have been a simple matter of firing the employee and filing a security report. But these weren't normal circumstances, and Michael Weber, according to the brief security file now open on her laptop, wasn't a normal janitor. The background check was almost comically sparse: 23 years of employment with no disciplinary actions, no sick days, no vacation requests. The man was either the most dedicated custodial worker in corporate history or someone with very specific reasons for maintaining an extremely low profile. What bothered Sarah more than the lack of information was what the security report had included: technical observations about radiation containment protocols that no janitor should have been able to make, much less understand. The guard who discovered him had noted that Weber seemed to know exactly what he was looking at when he pointed to specific data streams and explained why they indicated imminent systemic failure. When asked how he knew about radiation containment systems, Michael Weber had mentioned a specific type of reactor design that was classified beyond top secret, a prototype that only 7 people in the world were supposed to know existed. Either they had a security leak of unprecedented proportions, or their janitor was someone very different from his employment records suggested. Sarah picked up her phone and dialed the security desk. "This is Dr. Chun. Regarding the incident in Sublevel 3, I want Michael Weber brought to my office immediately. And make sure he brings whatever data he was looking at with him. I have a feeling this conversation is going to be more interesting than our usual disciplinary meetings." As she waited for the elevator to deliver the most unusual appointment of her career, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the next few hours would determine not just the fate of her company, but possibly the safety of everyone within a 100-mile radius of their facility. The city sparkled below her like a field of stars, beautiful and fragile, and utterly unaware that their continued existence might depend on whatever a night shift janitor had discovered in the depths of a building they would never see. Michael stood in the elevator, flanked by 2 security guards who seemed unsure whether they were escorting a potential terrorist or a confused employee who'd taken a wrong turn. The ride to the 42nd floor felt like ascending through layers of his own buried past, each floor marking another year since he'd last set foot in the rarefied air of executive decision-making. The man who emerged from that elevator would be different from the one who had entered it. He could feel the transformation beginning already, the careful walls he'd built around his former identity starting to crumble under the weight of moral necessity. Dr. Sarah Chun was younger than he'd expected, probably in her early 40s, with the kind of sharp intelligence that showed in her eyes before she ever spoke a word. She stood behind her desk as they entered, her posture suggesting someone accustomed to command, but her expression revealing genuine curiosity rather than corporate hostility. The security guards positioned themselves by the door, while Michael found himself standing in the center of an office that probably cost more to furnish than he earned in 5 years. "Mr. Weber," Dr. Chin began, her voice carrying a slight accent that suggested education at international institutions. "My security team tells me you have some concerns about our monitoring systems. Concerns that seem remarkably sophisticated for someone whose job description involves floor maintenance." Michael met her gaze without flinching, recognizing in her the same hunger for truth that had once driven his own research. "Dr. Chun, what I have are 23 years of watching brilliant people make catastrophic mistakes because they're too proud to listen to anyone who doesn't share their credentials. And what I've discovered tonight is that someone in your organization is manipulating safety data to hide a containment failure that will kill thousands of people if it's not addressed in the next 72 hours. The silence that followed was deafening. Dr. Chin's eyes narrowed as she processed not just his words, but the way he'd delivered them, with the confidence of someone who understood exactly what he was talking about. She gestured to a chair across from her desk, and for the first time in over 2 decades, Michael Weber sat down as an equal in a room where decisions about life and death were made. "Show me," she said simply, and Michael knew that the janitor was about to disappear forever, replaced by the man he'd tried so hard to bury but could never quite kill. The data spread across Dr. Chen's wall-mounted display like a roadmap to disaster, each graph and chart telling a story that grew more terrifying with every detail Michael revealed. Using the executive conference room's sophisticated projection system, he walked her through 3 weeks of carefully manipulated readings, showing her how someone with intimate knowledge of their monitoring protocols had been systematically masking a gradual but accelerating failure in the primary containment system. Here, Michael pointed to a series of seemingly minor fluctuations in the radiation readings, his voice taking on the measured cadence of someone who had spent decades translating complex technical concepts for non-technical audiences. These variations look random to anyone not familiar with the specific harmonic patterns of containment field degradation. But if you apply the Hendricks-Morrison algorithm, an analysis technique that most people think is purely theoretical, you can see that these fluctuations follow a precise mathematical progression. Dr. Chen leaned forward, her CEO's skepticism warring with her scientist's recognition that she was listening to someone who understood these systems at a level that few people in the world could match. "The Hendricks-Morrison algorithm isn't publicly available," she said carefully. "The research was classified before it could be published." Michael's smile was grim. "I know. I helped develop it." The revelation hung in the air between them like a live wire, crackling with implications that neither of them was quite ready to fully grasp. Dr. Chen's mind raced through the possibilities. Who was this man, really? How had someone with access to classified research techniques ended up pushing a mop in her building? And most importantly, if he was right about the containment failure, how long did they have before theoretical disaster became very real catastrophe? "Dr. Weber," she said, the title slipping out before she could stop herself. "Assuming your analysis is correct, what exactly are we looking at in terms of timeline and scope?" Michael's expression darkened as he manipulated the display to show predictive models based on the current rate of degradation. "If the containment field continues to degrade at this rate, we're looking at a cascading failure within 60 to 72 hours. The initial breach would be contained within the facility, but the secondary effects, radiation release, contamination of the cooling systems, potential explosion due to hydrogen buildup, those would extend far beyond these walls." The implications were staggering. They weren't just talking about a corporate crisis or an environmental incident. They were talking about a potential evacuation zone stretching for miles in every direction, about thousands of people whose lives would be permanently disrupted, about a company and an industry that might never recover from the public relations nightmare. But worse than any of that was the human cost, the cancer rates and birth defects and environmental damage that would persist for generations. Dr. Chen walked to her window, staring out at the city lights that suddenly seemed more precious and fragile than they had just hours before. "If you're right about this, Michael, then someone in my organization has been committing what amounts to mass attempted murder. The question is who, and why, and what we can do to stop it." Michael joined her at the window, two figures silhouetted against the sleeping city they were trying to protect. The who is someone with administrative access to the monitoring systems and detailed knowledge of containment protocols. The why is probably money, either covering up an expensive mistake or avoiding a costly shutdown that would impact profitability. And the what we can do. He paused, staring out at the millions of lives that hung in the balance. "That depends on how much you're willing to risk to save them." Dr. David Hartmann, Meridian Energy's chief operating officer, sat alone in his home office at 4:23 a.m., staring at an encrypted message that represented the collapse of everything he'd built. Someone had discovered the systematic data manipulation hiding the containment failure for 3 weeks. The discoverer was a janitor named Michael Weber. Dr. Chun had been informed. David's hands trembled as 15 years of deception pressed down on him. The containment failure hadn't been his fault. It resulted from his predecessor's cost-cutting measures. But David had discovered the problem 6 months ago and made the fateful decision to hide it rather than report it. The mathematics had seemed simple. Shutting down for emergency repairs would cost nearly $2 billion. The failure was gradual, and according to his calculations, they had 18 months before it became critical. 18 months to implement repairs during scheduled maintenance. But somehow 18 months had become 3 weeks, and now David was staring at a timeline measured in hours rather than months. The emergency board meeting convened at 6:17 a.m. 12 board members filed in with grim expressions. Dr. Sarah Chun sat with Michael Weber beside her, an arrangement that raised eyebrows about protocol and security clearances. Michael had spent 2 hours walking through his analysis with senior engineering staff, watching their faces change from skepticism to panic as they verified his calculations. The containment failure was real, the timeline accurate, and the consequences catastrophic. David Hartmann entered precisely on time, his usual confidence intact despite the circumstances. He took his seat opposite Dr. Chun, eyes briefly meeting Michael's. "We are here because Mr. Weber has brought to our attention a critical safety issue," Dr. Chun began. "I'll let him explain." Michael stood slowly, aware that every word would be scrutinized by lawyers, regulators, and historians. 6 hours ago, I discovered evidence of systematic data manipulation designed to hide progressive failure in our primary containment systems. The failure has been ongoing for 3 weeks, and at current degradation rate, we have between 54 and 68 hours before cascading breach that could result in radiation release affecting thousands of people. David cleared his throat. "Mr. Weber, while we appreciate your observations, you're not exactly qualified to make these assessments." Michael's response was devastating. "Mr. Hartmann, I spent 12 years developing the safety protocols your engineering staff uses every day. The reason I can see this pattern is because I helped design the systems that are failing. And the reason you've been able to hide this failure is because you've been manipulating the same monitoring algorithms I helped create." David's face cycled through emotions: surprise, anger, calculation, and finally resigned determination. "You want to talk about qualifications, Weber? Let's talk about Dr. Michael Weber, whose expertise resulted in a containment breach that nearly irradiated half the region 12 years ago." But instead of backing down, Michael seemed to grow more solid. "You're absolutely right, David. I made a mistake 12 years ago that could have hurt people. The difference between us is that I learned from my mistake, while you're about to repeat it on a scale that will make my failure look like a minor hiccup." Dr. Chin stepped forward. "David, is Mr. Weber's analysis accurate? Has there been a systematic effort to hide containment failures?" The room was completely silent. Then David's shoulders sagged. "The containment issues began 14 weeks ago," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "We've been managing the situation to avoid unnecessary panic and economic disruption." The truth spread through the room like radiation itself, contaminating every assumption and destroying every comfortable lie. The next 18 hours passed in a blur of emergency protocols and desperate calculations as Meridian Energy transformed from a smoothly running corporation into a crisis response organization. Michael found himself at the center of a hurricane of activity, no longer the invisible janitor, but now the expert whose knowledge might be the only thing standing between routine industrial crisis and environmental catastrophe. Working alongside the company's senior engineering staff, Michael guided them through the complex process of understanding exactly how bad the situation had become and what options remained for preventing the worst-case scenarios. The news was universally grim. The containment field degradation had accelerated beyond even his pessimistic projections, leaving them with perhaps 36 hours before the cascade failure that would trigger automatic safety shutdowns and potential radiation release. "The primary cooling system is already showing stress fractures," Dr. Jennifer Martinez, Meridian's head of nuclear safety, reported as she reviewed the real-time monitoring data. "If we lose coolant containment at the same time as the radiation shielding fails, we're looking at a steam explosion that could breach the outer containment vessel." Michael nodded grimly as he studied the schematic displays that covered every wall of the emergency command center. "The good news is that we caught it before the cascade became irreversible. The bad news is that stopping it will require a complete emergency shutdown of the reactor core, and that's a process that takes at least 18 hours under optimal conditions." Dr. Chin stood at the center of the controlled chaos, coordinating with federal regulatory agencies and emergency response teams, while simultaneously trying to manage the media firestorm that had erupted when news of the crisis leaked to the press. "Michael," Dr. Chun called across the command center, "I need your best assessment of our options." Michael looked around the room at the faces of engineers and executives who were depending on him for answers. "We have 3 options," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the command center. Option 1. We attempt a controlled emergency shutdown, which gives us about a 70% chance of containing the crisis but guarantees massive economic losses and regulatory consequences. Option 2. We try to implement emergency repairs while the reactor is still online, which is incredibly dangerous but might allow us to avoid a complete shutdown. Option 3. We evacuate the surrounding area and let the cascade failure happen, then deal with the contamination and media nightmare that follows. Dr. Chin walked to the display showing radiation projections for the surrounding area, where millions of people were going about their daily lives completely unaware that their safety hung in the balance of decisions being made in this windowless room. "What would you do, Michael?" she asked. Michael joined her at the display, staring at the map that showed schools and hospitals and shopping centers full of people who deserved better. "I'd choose option 1, he said without hesitation. A 70% chance of success is better than a 100% chance of disaster. And if we're going to fail, let's fail while trying to do the right thing." The emergency shutdown proceeded with agonizing precision over the next 18 hours, each step monitored by teams of experts who understood that a single mistake could transform a controlled crisis into an uncontrolled disaster. Michael moved between monitoring stations like a conductor orchestrating a symphony of complex technical procedures, his presence somehow reassuring to engineers who had been trained to follow protocols but had never faced a situation where the protocols themselves might not be adequate. As the hours passed, the crisis slowly transformed from immediate emergency to managed situation. The reactor core achieved stable shutdown configuration. The radiation levels dropped to normal ranges, and the computerized monitoring systems began displaying the green indicators that meant the worst-case scenarios were no longer imminent threats. Media attention had intensified rather than diminished as the story evolved from potential disaster to corporate scandal. When Michael stepped outside the facility for the first time in 36 hours, squinting in sunlight that seemed impossibly bright, a young reporter called out, "Dr. Weber, can you tell us how you discovered the safety violations that led to this crisis?" Michael paused, suddenly aware that his answer would be recorded and broadcast to millions of people who were trying to understand how a company could come so close to causing a disaster of unprecedented proportions. Instead of deflecting, he looked directly into the camera and spoke with the quiet authority of someone who had learned that truth was more important than comfort. "I discovered the problem because I was in the right place at the right time with the right knowledge to recognize what I was seeing. But the real question isn't how I found it. It's how a safety crisis this serious could develop without anyone in the official hierarchy noticing or caring enough to act." 6 months later, Michael Weber served as director of the newly created Institute for Industrial Safety Ethics. David Hartmann served 18 months in prison. Dr. Sarah Chun became chairman of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Emma graduated valedictorian and studied nuclear engineering, building on her father's lessons. Michael Weber had become proof that expertise and conscience could triumph over power when someone was willing to pay the price for truth. The silent guardian had found his voice.